If you're having any discussions, can you take it outside, please? We really do need to get going. Delegates? Can we reconvene, please, chiefs and delegates? Inviting forward Cookby Wilson, Cheryl Casimir, Regional Chief TG, Catherine Lapa, and Cookby Wayne Christian. Could you all come to the front, please?
Oh, you're not sounding so good there.
Because as mentioned, the RDG is only here for 1 hour, so we do need to get going. So for this presentation, Cookby Wilson is going to take us through a PowerPoint, after which the Leadership Council, Cheryl, Terry, and Cookby will take your questions. Afterward, Catherine Lapa will take us through an update response from Canada's perspective. And then questions, of course, and then Cookby Christian will present on the Schweppen model through a deck as well. So Cookby and mic 23.
White. Thank you so much. Sorry we're rushed today, but it's a really important subject on reform of Indigenous child welfare that we've been working on for quite some time. I'm very happy to have Catherine Lappe and Cheryl Casimir and Regional Chief TG to our 50th AGA for the Union BC Indian Chiefs. We've been working very hard on this for quite some time. So the purpose of their presentation is to provide an update on the Indigenous child welfare to the Union BC Indian Chiefs AGA delegates with a focus on federal legislation and the tripartite working group activity. And there is a slide, hopefully it's handed out to you. I'll try to do that. There's also materials in your kit, and I believe it is it tab 3, Andrea? It's in tab 3, and the materials in your kit would be a letter to the Minister Philpott with the First Nations Leadership Summary Position Paper on federal legislation, information from all chiefs meeting in September in Vancouver, Nanaimo, and Prince George on child and family well-being, which focused on legislation. And this includes information on Canada's questions to First Nations. The next material in the kit is the First Nations Leadership Support for Spirit Bear Plan, and to end the inequities in all federal funded public services for First Nations children, youth, and families. There's also a briefing from BC Aboriginal Child Care Society on First Nations Early Learning and Child Care Framework implementation. There's also included in your kits correspondence from BC re the amendments to the Child Welfare Act. Okay, so I'll switch it to, trying to keep remembering to switch it. The next slide is about the provincial landscape and new developments. As you're aware, Provincial Child, Family and Community Service Act amendments passed this year in May, but are not yet proclaimed. The Act must be interpreted and administered in accordance with the new guiding principle. And note, this is partial text from the United Nations Declaration. The new section is Indigenous families and Indigenous communities share responsibility for the upbringing and well-being of Indigenous children. The other provincial developments in the amendments allow for greater involvement in child welfare. agreements with First Nations to transfer files for children even if there are no delegated agencies, so that's new. Children-specific agreements for First Nations to become involved in a case-by-case basis. Other provincial developments, agreements with First Nations on information sharing, so you can see, so you can know how many of your children, your kids are in the system, where they are, and plan for transfer of service and self-determination based systems. So that's new. Stronger language for working with First Nations and respect their culture and history of First Nations children, including reorganizing impact of residential school, which many of you spoke about this morning for the systemic issues with residential school. The tripartite working group, that was supposed to be a technical working group presentation, Dawn Thomas, but I'm not sure if her flight, she wasn't able to get a flight or something. I could be updated on that. The technical working group comprises of First Nations leadership representatives, federal government and provincial government, the Ministry of Child and Family Development, and an internal advisory committee includes delegated agencies and non-affiliated communities. The technical working group is prepared for First Nations control over child welfare and support to transition to greater involvement, control, and self-determination over children welfare, and as directed by resolutions. The immediate priority for the First Nations Leadership Council to focus. The technical working group is working on the CEF, CSA amendments and potential for federal child welfare legislation. We're discussing all changes to prepare and consider funding issues and promote fairness and equal access to resources and opportunities. Those are the many issues that the chiefs have voiced at the province-wide sessions and many of the meetings that we've had. The technical working group, I'm just saying it wrong, tripartite working group, sorry, is currently working to update our work plan based on the action plan on children and families, so that that was endorsed by First Nations in BC through resolution at Union BC Indian Chiefs, First Nations Summit, and the BCAFN. The Union BC Indian Chiefs' current mandate is from a 2018-20 resolution calling for Canada to recognize child and family safety and well-being, including child welfare. The resolution, I believe, the packages are in the kit, requires Canada to provide sustained and cultural-based and needs-based funding and legislative recognition to enable First Nations to exercise their right to care for children, youth, and families. And the next highlight is to co-create guidelines for the implementation of such recognition legislation based on self-determination, human rights, the Truth and Reconciliation, 94 Calls to Action, and the UN Declaration. The next slide on page 5, if you're following through your slide deck, federal child welfare reform initiatives. There was an emergency meeting called by Minister Philpott in January to call for a process to consider legislation to recognize First Nations' inherent authority and control over child welfare to change the failed policies of the past. There's wide consensus for a significant change in legislation that will be based on the United Nations Declaration, Human Rights, and Section 35, refute the Indian Act policies, and give room for self-determination resources and major shifts. So that's some of the reform initiatives happening. What to expect? Pressure for change in this area is being heard at every level. That's, I guess, something that's occurred right across Canada and within our communities in the province at all levels. Major court decisions on children and stronger recognition of keeping families together and respecting involvement for chiefs and leaders to support their families and their communities. Other major changes possible in the province with new CSA changes for the Act, and also further improvements if they implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People framework to this area. More of what to expect. Federal legislation will provide a major opportunity for community-driven change with First Nations inherent title and right holders being recognized as the drivers of change, and space to assert Indigenous law and put First Nation systems back at the center of the work. All of the work is based on human rights, safety for children, and repairing damage done by the failed Crown policies. Important slide now, next steps. The tripartite working group will receive a report on the recent all chiefs sessions and working to action outcomes, continued engagement with Canada on federal funding and legislation as directed by UBCIC Resolution 2018-20. Tripartite working group will update work plan and report back to nations. Continue working for the implementation of Jordan's Principle and Spirit Bear Plan and action recommendations from Jordan Principle Summit in September. So that's all the work. I know a lot of the chiefs can attend the Jordan Principle session on September 11th, 12th, because you were at the Recognition and Rights Implementation Framework session, the policy session held by AFN. So that information on Jordan's Principle is coming out, and their recommendations moving forward. Basically, in BC, we haven't been accessing and utilizing the Jordan's Principle enough. So I think that was one of the other issues from that report. And I think I've got this twice. I think that was the end. How do I go back there? I'll just leave it on the next steps, and I'll invite my colleagues, Regional Chief Terry Teegee and Cheryl Casimir, if they want to say a couple of comments on the presentation, so we can open it right up to remarks. Our intent today was the chiefs to have space to have dialogue and discussion on this, because I know this has been moving really fast. Cook's Jam.
Like 22.
Thanks, Chief Judy, and thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Cheryl Casimir with the First Nations Summit, and one of the leads here with my colleague on this very important file. Just to follow up on a couple of things in relation to the Child and Family Services Act amendments. In terms of obtaining information on your children as to where they are, so that you can be more involved in the planning of their care. The Leadership Council our technical team is currently working on a template with British Columbia. So it'll be a streamlined process that leadership can access and use, and submit it to the province to obtain that very important information, as we understand that that's one of the obstacles or the barriers that communities have in terms of being able to put plans of care into place for children that are in care. The other couple of other things, we have a new representative for children and youth. Her name is Dr. Jennifer Charlesworth. She was at the two-day session that was held last week, and I met her there for the first time. Leadership Council is currently following up on a formal invitation that was submitted to her office for a meeting with her. We really want to make sure that we get off together on the right foot and have a better working relationship than we did with the previous RCY. And I'm not being negative against Bernard. The way he did business was a lot different than what we're used to. So we just want to make sure that we have a good relationship with Jennifer. She's receptive to meeting with us, and even interested in having a conversation about whether we need to enter some kind of protocol agreement or an arrangement that commits us to meeting on a regular basis and receiving reports from her. Dawn Thomas was contracted with us, and Chief Judy mentioned that she wasn't able to make it today. I just want to thank her, even though she's not here, but to publicly thank her for the work that she's done for us up to date. Dawn's last day with the Leadership Council will be on October 12th. Given that there's a new RCY in place, she's going to go back to the office and provide that support to the RCY, Jennifer Charlesworth. So we will be looking at figuring out how we're going to fill that position. We're not sure yet whether it's going to be a contracted position, whether we're going to do a call out, but if you have any ideas, we need somebody who is ready to take off on the ground. And we're looking for a senior policy analyst with expertise in the area of child welfare. We have no time for training. We have nothing like that. With the pace of the work that's happening, we need somebody who can do the work right away. I'm also a representative on the AFN working group on the federal legislation front, and we've had a couple of sessions. I've shared with my colleagues that I'm a bit concerned about the work that's taken place at that level, and I think it's common that when you're trying to do work at a national level, you sometimes miss opportunity to capture all of the regional interests and priorities. And so we're kind of stumbling along on this working group. And that working group was formed as a result of a resolution that was passed at the last AFN, I believe the July one. No, the one previous to that. And speaking of the AFN, and I'm just going to be frank about this, having some real concerns, and maybe Regional Chief can speak to it further, about the manner in which the national office is intervening in the work that's laid out in front of us in terms of being a priority. We are working really hard and really fast on trying to meet the deadline to get child welfare legislation into place. And up until recently, we found out that the national office is putting demands, or had been putting demands, on the federal government for things to happen first before the child welfare legislation, and it caused us some great concern. Mary Ellen Chappelle-Lafond, we announced to leadership at a few of our sessions, has also been contracted with us to do this important work, and her expertise is, we wouldn't be able to do the work without having Mary Ellen on our side. And so Mary Ellen was contracted as one of the primary leads for the AFN on the legislative working group, and the first day, I believe, of the forum last week, we got word that AFN terminated that contract. And so, of course, we're all up in arms because we need Mary Ellen at that table. We need her expertise. She has expertise in drafting legislation, and so that's why we brought her on board. Anyway. Leadership Council stepped in and we said, well, that's just totally unacceptable. We are going to appoint Mary Ellen as the Leadership Council representative for British Columbia. So we sent the letter off to Canada and to the AFN office and directed that Mary Ellen will represent us on all matters relating to child welfare for British Columbia. So she's back in the fold again. But this is the kind of antics that causes me concern. Regional Chief wasn't even consulted by the national office that this was going to happen, and so yeah, it's just a little bit worrisome. We are working on making sure that British Columbia continues to have our interests brought forward to this working group, and that we have proper representation on this legislative working group and anything else related to child welfare for that matter. So that leads me to the forum that took place on September 25th and 26th. It was in Richmond. Some of you were there. We spent a couple of days talking about the child welfare legislation, and we did breakouts in which we talked about identifying principles that would guide the work, jurisdiction issues, as well as identifying some impacts. And it was a fulsome couple of days, and we were able to get a lot of work done over that short period of time. But I think given the priority that child welfare is to each and every one of us, we were able to roll up our sleeves and just get on with that work. So our technical teams are working on preparing a final report that we want to make sure gets sent back out to all of the participants in the communities, hoping that you'll take the opportunity to review it, make sure that what you had put forth is reflected in that report. It's going to form the foundation for the work that we want to see in terms of the legislation. I mentioned in my comments yesterday about the short time frame that is available to us to get this work done. I was pleased that at the session we were able to come to a level of consensus on federal legislation. I think that everybody knows it's important and it's a priority. We did not hear anybody stand up and say, no, we are opposed to it. And again, British Columbia is doing all of this work. We're preparing ourselves, and the other regions are not in the same position as us. And so I believe that we're going to find ourselves in the situation that we will find ourselves on the rights recognition framework with this child welfare legislation, because we know that there's a couple of regions who are not fully supportive of it. Also, at the forum, we met, I believe it was the first time, with the 84 non-delegated communities and had an opportunity to hear from them directly on what their issues were. Also, there's federal funding that's available, and the purpose was to also share with them options on how these resources could be dispersed, or else to hear from them directly if they had any alternate options. And so that was a good session. I know that at first there were a lot of issues and concerns that were being raised. I think because the 84 communities feel that they've been left out of a lot of the work that's been underway, but with the commitment from the three of us, Canada, British Columbia, and the Leadership Council meeting, we hope to keep everybody in the loop on what's happening around child and family. So I think that's pretty much it for my report, and we will continue to do the work related to the legislation based on your direction and your input, and look forward to hearing from you directly on any issues or concerns you may have in deliberations following this. Thanks.
Okay, we're going to change things up just a little bit. We'll hear from Regional Chief right now. We'll follow Regional Chief with Catherine's comments, and then we'll open it up to questions, comments for both presentations. Staying at mic 22.
Masai Chair, Tai Masai Sodesni, Kamloops First Nations, and just want to acknowledge the territory and say thank you, Masai Cho. I just want to say thank you to my colleagues, Judy and Cheryl, for being really carrying this torch in regards to child welfare legislation. And I've been on this file for approximately 11 months, and during that time, I certainly know all the challenges of many of our communities and many of our organizations in regards to child welfare and gaining the jurisdiction that you need to make decisions for how your children are being governed and administered, and really the family unit. So much of this is part of the tripartite working group that has signed a reconciliation charter with the province and the federal government to look at ways and a shared vision on child welfare reform. And I think that's really where we are cooperating and looking at not only provincial legislation, but also federal legislation. As mentioned earlier, last week we had the two-day session in regards to what we would see not only provincial legislation, but also federal legislation. And in terms of the federal legislation, as I stated in my comments last week, was that BC is well ahead of many of the other regions in this country. And to me, I really believe that much of the legislation, whether it's child welfare or any other ones that we're discussing, will live and die in British Columbia. Because here is where we have the political will, and we have the resources, and we have the capacity to have people look at and capacity to draft legislation and create legislation that has meaning to our people and to our organizations and to our governance. Much of this is predicated on resolutions that were passed at the AFN, and that is what we're following from the Leadership Council point of view. We're really looking back to what was passed in terms of the resolution that was passed a couple of AGMs ago, and that's where we're taking the directions from all the chiefs across this country to create this working group, which involves the National Advisory Council, which is represented for British Columbia by Mary Teegee and my representative, Cheryl Casimir, to look at and develop this legislation. And I think it's really important that we carry on with what that resolution and continue on with the good work that has come out of that working group. And also the work that we've doing with Mary Ellen in terms of drafting this legislation. It's quite difficult. I know it's coming hard and fast, but also too, it's a window of opportunity where we have not only the provincial governments at the table, but also the federal government willing to work with our governance and our people in British Columbia to create legislation. And you know, there's been testimony, I believe this week and last week in Winnipeg in regards to the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And we heard about it just before lunch, but also that direct connection between children and care and many of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. There's a direct connection, and that was laid out clearly with one of the testimonies in Winnipeg this past week. But also, too, one of my files that I do have at the federal level with the AFN is justice, and that direct connection between all the youth in care connected with the high rates of incarceration with our youth in jail, and there's a direct connection there. So, you know, this is part of a huge puzzle, and a big part of it is children in care and what we can do about making sure that, you know, we have all the checks and balances there for when our children are taken into care, that we're a part of those decision-making processes. And I just want to thank my colleagues, and I want to acknowledge the 50th anniversary of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and congratulate them for 50 years of fighting for all of our people. And 50 years ago, it was my chief that was here from Takla Lake First Nation. Mark French was my chief back then, and he was in this meeting 50 years ago, and I see his name on the list. So I'm really happy to be here and present on behalf of the BCAFN, but more so on behalf of an Indigenous person from Takla Lake First Nation. So Masai Cho.
Masai Regional Chief, Catherine, microphone 23.
Good afternoon. Firstly, I'd like to thank Chief Seymour and Tecumseh for hosting us for this important session. As the regional chief was just saying, this is very much a momentous occasion to be here on the 50th anniversary of UBCIC. As an organization, you have advocated for the rights of First Nations with passion, principle, vision, and integrity. You have promoted a better and fairer vision of Canada. You've held government to account, and you've pushed the legal landscape for Indigenous rights. I appreciate that you don't always agree with us in government, but I thank you for always treating us with respect and honor, and that we can work collaboratively on important areas such as this. BC Region is right now working actually with the UBCIC archivists so that we can have a display in our building to commemorate the 50 years of UBCIC. So I hope that as many of you come to our building that you're able to see that we truly are wanting to honor your contributions. I would also be remiss to dine and dash out of here without recognizing your president for his 20 years of steadfast leadership. You have always embodied the principles of UBCIC with honor. You've spoken truth, and you've been ahead of your times. You are often prescient and in your words and predictions, and I've learned to recognize that history often proves you right. So I'm honored to be able to hear your words often and to be able to work with all of you. So I just wanted to take a moment to recognize this important milestone. Secondly, I'm really pleased to be here with our co-presenters here with the First Nations Leadership Council. The great thing about having such a strong collaboration is that I really don't need to say that much because they've been able to cover the waterfront on most areas. I would start again by emphasizing what Cheryl and Terry have said, that it really is BC that's leading the way in a vision and a direction forward on child and family services reform. So I encourage all of you to continue to participate in the dialogue and to provide feedback on what you see your priorities to be. This is really an opportunity for us to fully recognize Indigenous rights in one of the most important areas for the future of your nations. And it is hopefully going to be a historic time for us to move things forward. As people have mentioned, Ministers Bennett and Philpott hosted an emergency meeting in January, and there were 6 points of action. I'm only going to touch on a few of them because some of them have already been covered. The first one, though, is, and it's important for us to remember, that we are continuing the work to fully implement all orders from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. So in our region, our staff are working with the delegated Aboriginal agencies to develop claims for retroactive expenses and to develop needs-based budgets moving forward in order to address what was deemed by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal as a discriminatory formula against what is available to other kids that are getting services by the province. So I also want to just put on the floor that those communities that are represented by delegated Aboriginal agencies, if you have needs for prevention and well-being, to please work with your delegated Aboriginal agencies because they can put forward your proposals so that you can get enhanced funding for prevention above and beyond what we're providing the delegated Aboriginal agencies. And I know money is not everything, but it can be an important piece in allowing you to do some of the most important activities to support your kids staying in your communities and for family preservation. Over the last few years, through some of the prevention funding that has increasingly been made available, we have been able to support a number of communities through pilot projects. And as Cheryl mentioned, we also have $12.3 million available to the 84 communities that are not represented by delegated Aboriginal agencies and are trying to work through what the appropriate allocation methodology would be. We may need to do an interim one for this year so we can get money out the door. I'm hopeful that we can just get a base amount out to each of the 84 communities shortly, and then we can discuss how to distribute the rest so that people can start spending those resources in the most effective way. We've already touched on number 2, which is exploring the potential for co-developed federal child welfare legislation. I just want to remind folks that this is something that has been requested for many years and through many forums, whether the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Grand Chief Ed John's report, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and others. But having said that, the minister wants to be clear that she will not proceed with legislation unless there is consensus and support for legislation, and that she wants to co-develop the legislation so that it meets your needs. As we all know, legislation can cover any broad range of topics, but we're hopeful that we get your directions on how to move forward on doing that. It could create a statutory commitment for funding levels, creating stability and funding for communities to be able to provide the services that meet their unique needs. It could set principles and standards in keeping with the UN Declaration, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and much more. So I'll leave it at that, but again, appreciate the input of those of you to date and look forward to more going forward. The third element that she committed to is accelerating the work of tripartite technical tables. So the tripartite working group here that we're just debriefing you on, there is a commitment to accelerate and support that work going forward. And finally, I would just say, alongside of those pieces, there is also a tremendous amount of work being done in BC by about close to a dozen different tables either under recognition of rights and recognition of Indigenous rights and self-determination tables or separately, often on a tripartite basis to support, recognize, and resource the jurisdiction of First Nations and Child and Family Services, and I'm sure you'll hear about it from Cook B. Christian shortly. And we look forward to the celebration with Minister Philpott in less than 2 weeks on that front. So I'll leave it at that, but thank you for your active participation in this area and hope that we'll continue to be able to have significant progress moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Opening up to questions and comments. Mike 16.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, thank the Kamloops people and the Union BC Indian Chiefs for inviting us here to share with our thoughts. And to me, this is a very important issue that we're speaking to, is child welfare. And I'm sorry, my name is William Wasden, or Bill Wasden Sr. from the Nungish First Nation. Just a little background, I am the chair of our Nungish Health Board, which deals also with the child welfare programs. And what I wanted to talk about is we've reverted back to the customary system of looking after our children, our youth. And that is, it takes a whole village to raise a child. And we have 0 children in custody. And it's been that way for about 8 years now. We had 1 in custody at that time but since then is aged out. But the way we proceeded with this is we gathered the whole tribe together at a general assembly, and we talked about our youth, and we talked about their needs, and we talked about the possibilities of some of them being apprehended. And of course, nobody wants that. So we decided that we would look at raising our children and looking after them in our own right. So then we met with the smaller family groups, or the Namima, as we call it at home. It's people of one family, and we talked to them about the possibilities. There are some children that were close to being apprehended, and we talked about how would we deal with this. And many of you here in this room have been raised by your grandparents. Oftentimes it was because your parents had deserted, or else there was other reasons or causes, and those social reasons are of no fault of their own, but the children needed some place to go. So the families met and decided, well, okay, Grand's too old, or so they had aunts and uncles, or they had older brothers and sisters, but members of the family took them in, and as opposed to going into custody and being adopted out or fostered out or put in those foster homes of people they don't know, and moving them away from our cultural background, our big house, our potlatching, our language programs. And we're quite proud of the fact now that we have 0 children in custody, and every time an issue comes up, we meet with the families and deal with it. And the families always take in their young people that are in need of help. There's only, I'm not sure if anybody else in the province has used this approach, but it's an approach that was, it was consistent throughout the ages with our people. That if your children needed you, then you were there. I guess it's come to some fame is that the Child Welfare Services asked us to do a video on our program so that it could be distributed amongst the other nations of the country, I would imagine. And we have produced that video, and it's available if you want to contact the Numgish First Nation in Alert Bay, BC, and they would make this, and it talks about how we achieved the protection of our youth and our children, and save them from going into the system that most times it's so hard for them to escape, even after they age out. It was, I'm not saying that it's the only way, but it's the way that worked for us, and it would be worthwhile for the anybody that has a close-knit community that our children and our youth are so precious to us. We got a name for them, for our youth and our children. It's Kwalayu. Kwalayu. And the very meaning of that word is my reason for living. So, we live with that, and we live with our ancient teachings. And but before I leave, I wanted to commend the people that are working on the legislation and that. It's good for some people. I don't know that it would be of much benefit to us, but who knows, maybe our system can fall on his face someday, but I congratulate you on all the hard work you're doing, and you can help other people. But I would like everybody to take a look at our system that we're using, and it's the only issue that we have is sometimes Granny will take one of the children in and raise them, but there's no financial support, and under present pension standards, it's a big burden upon the grandparents but they've never said no, and they never will. So I just wanted to share that with you. That it's a way to look, and it's something that we did immediately. We just we don't need anybody's permission to look after our children. We will do that, and we did it. And I'm really proud of the fact that we have 0 children in custody or in the system. Thank you.
Kirikasla, Chief. Mike 9.
Hello, Terry Wakas, Gwasala Nakalok Nason, proxy. I don't know, I've been all over in regards to dealing with children in care, and I keep coming to this table and they say they want to talk to us in regards to helping us with our kids. Nothing has really changed. We've got a few of our kids back, but the way they are. I agree with some of the people when they say, like what Bill said, grandparents should be able to take care of the kids, but back home, that's not even an option. They look at our older people as either crippled or they're not capable of doing it. When they don't understand our customs or our culture, that this is what keeps our elders alive, is looking after their grandkids, but they don't see it that way. And then you have meetings where they say, we're going to start paying money out for families to take in other kids. I've got 4 kids, I believe, in my care, and along with my own, and I don't get any money for them, and it doesn't bother me, because my heart is to get all the kids out of care. But when I ask for help to send one of my kids somewhere, they have the power, not me, and they've been living with me for 4 years. I still need permission from them. Why? They don't come check on him. He loves hockey, he loves going to sports. It's like pulling teeth when you ask for money from them to send them to hockey or soccer or baseball or anything like that. It's nothing. This question I keep asking, this family's been fighting for 6 years, got 2 of her kids back. They say they're transitioning the other 4. They didn't transition these kids when they took them. Why is there a transition period now? You're sending 2 back at a time. It's like they're looking for a way for them to screw up again and take those other 2 back. Why is that? Why is there a transition? Doesn't make any sense. I asked Campbell River about criminal record checks. They said they go back 3 years. I asked in different areas. I'm trying to get some answers, because for whatever reason, my people are scared to go for them, but yet they've been sober for 4 or 5 years and they want to start taking in our kids. But as soon as you throw in criminal record checks to them, they get scared. I want to know what it is MCFD is looking for, so I can assure my people that they can go apply and try and start taking our kids out of care. because we want to be like Bill and have no kids in care. And I believe our nation has the most, and this has been going on before I even became a counselor in 2000, and I've been fighting. Since I took on this portfolio, I've been fighting for our children in care. And then another thing is that why does MCFD have the power to take the kids if the parents pass away? That's not right. They took a young girl away from my daughter when she stepped up to take this, because her dad just passed away. MCFD said, no, my daughter doesn't drink. They live a clean life. She's a teacher. They said no. I don't understand them. It wasn't like she was being put in an abusive home. Why do they have that power to take kids away if the parents pass away? There's always grandparents. I take my grandkids. My house I got 12 people in my house. 8 of them are kids, teenagers, that I look after without any help from them. I'm not getting this whole process of what it is they're looking for. I need help with this transition thing. You got kids. We got kids down here that were in Kelowna. Took them 4 years to transfer them back to Port Hardy. Their files. Why can't they just transfer files where their family is? That's continuously going on in Campbell River. We've got so many files down there, and their families have been in Port Hardy for 3+ years asking for their files to be transferred. It's not making any sense. We can't fight for them and give them the support they need if their files are in Campbell River. Treatment centers, they say, well, they're not stating whether it's a must. They've been going through every program that they've been asked of. And people, when they say, well, I want you to go to a treatment center, they don't understand it takes pretty close to a year for you to even get into one in some cases. So that holds the process back of getting their kids returned after doing so much work. I showed a paper like this, to MCFD for all the programs that our people go to, and I asked them, is that not good enough? You asked for it, they did it, and no, they still don't get an overnight visit. It takes all that work for them for nothing. They don't get nothing. I continue to ask for visits or overnights, transitioning them back home, but why is it they can't do it? It's very frustrating. Some of our people have gone back to drinking because of battling for 3 or 4 years and still nothing, no signs of their kids coming home. I asked them to meet them halfway and say, please give them something for this work that they've done. I just don't know. It's something that I care for, and I just hope we get some answers for these.
Thank you. Final comment, Mike 13.
Clifford White, Kitkatlaw. We have I'd like to thank the Shuswap people for allowing us to do this work on their territory. We have, other than Bill, we have the highest number of children in BC in care. And I'm a product of unfortunately, the Ministry of Child and Family Services process. With the number of our people that are living away from our communities, 100% of the children that are in care from my community, Kitkatlaw, are all our people who are living away. living in urban areas. So we did review that. We took it to the table, and very much like Bill, we have a process by which if the families are within the community, it does take a community to raise a child, and there's a commitment on behalf of the families to actually take the children in. And as a matter of fact, I now have a daughter. I thought I was free and clear, but now I'm raising one. She's now 7 years old, and it's a beautiful young girl who's actually teaching me a lot of lessons. But anyway, the process is flawed. There's a huge expectation that First Nations should be able to just take their children back. But one of the things, the major piece is the safety piece. And a lot of times our communities have to be re-educated because a lot of that has been torn down. It's to be the whole taking care of our people from day one on the lifestyle that we've been brought up on, and now trying to have a self-governing process in place, which is very important. I know that what we should be having here is not necessarily all of Chief and Council around this table. We should be having hereditary. That's our true governing system. For our place where we come from, we go to our hereditary table, we get directions from them as Chief and Council, and this is where, on the legislative part, we need to acknowledge our elders and our hereditary system for what has been taken away from them, and to be put back into place. One day we should be sitting around this table, and it's not governed by Chief and Council, but it's governed by hereditary representatives who are all sitting around this table and taking full responsibility for not only our children, but a whole bunch of other things that are there. Within the urban area, we've set up a First Nations Child and Family Services by which elders from across the country are working with the courts to try to keep children out of care. And so I know that the number of urban areas are starting to look at this as well. Within the New Westminster area, it's 2 years in the making, and they've been doing a great deal of work through the Spirit of the Children. So I strongly agree, though, that our communities, very much like the Namgis, who are taking full responsibility, that's where legislation needs to empower our communities. I'd like to see, our communities taking that full responsibility on there, and within the urban area, to have that same authorities and powers by the organizations that have been set up to work with us to keep our children out of care. So I know, Catherine, you mentioned that you had 6 points that you wanted to touch on. You mentioned 4. I don't know what the other 2 were. And as a final remark, is I have quite a bit of work that I've done within Child and Family, and I'm very interested in the legislative process. So if you are looking for another person to help review that legislation, I would like to put my name forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chief. Responses, concluding remarks, starting at microphone 23.
So thank you all for the feedback. I think all of you have delineated why we need to change the system fundamentally. I mean, the Government of Canada recognized provincial jurisdiction in this area and has been a funder for many years without being an active player in this area. And what the legislation is intended to do is to change that in such a way that finally the jurisdiction of First Nations are properly recognized. Because ultimately, if we just tinker with the current system, we're not going to get to the results that all of you are looking for. And we can do it individually as SNTC and others are doing. There were comments about from Chief White about recognizing the hereditary leadership. Next week, Minister Bennett, along with the province, will be celebrating Wet'suwet'en's jurisdiction MOU, which recognizes the hereditary and elected leadership. It is the first time we have done that. So there is progress on its way, but we need all of you to keep pushing us in that direction and working with us on it. If I can turn to Councillor Wackes's comments. Wackes's comments. Got some help up here. In fact, I was talking to MCFD about your community just last week at the Child and Family Services Conference, and I know that they've recently come to visit, but I hear that there are long-standing issues. So I offer if we can help you with that in any way and perhaps get folks together to talk about how we move forward, we're certainly happy to do so. We certainly appreciate the challenges you're facing and want to support you on that moving forward. So maybe I'll just leave it at that, and happy to have any of you contact us separately as well if you want to have follow-up conversations.
Okay. Staying at mic 23.
Thank you, everyone, for your comments and for the support on this important work. And I think that the success stories are as a result of nations just taking the bull by the horns and just taking control and saying that and exercising our inherent right to our children and to govern ourselves in the manner that meets our needs. And so, and then on the other spectrum, when we're talking about some of the major concerns and issues that are still happening in our communities, it just reinforces the need for us to continue this work to the point where we have legislation in place where we can exercise our jurisdiction and authority on child welfare and do it in a way that we want to do it and not be bound by systems and policies and practices that do not support us and do not meet our needs. As well, in line with the legislation, I think that one of the other areas that we continue to put pressure on is that there needs to be the adequate resourcing that's going to support the work. We need the resourcing in place that's going to allow us to be able to implement those changes that come with this legislation. And it can't be short-term funding. We need to look at sustainable long-term funding that will support the unique needs and the unique governance models that will come into effect when the legislation is in place. I just wanted to respond to Councillor Wackem. I'm so sorry to hear that you're still facing those challenges in your community. Grand Chief Ed John and myself went into his community and met with leadership and had MCFD representatives with us at the time too, and we were certain that as a result of that conversation that there were commitments made to make some changes with your leadership and your community. So it really is unfortunate. As well, we don't have an MCFD representative with us here today, but I assure you that Leadership Council will definitely take your issues back and we'll discuss at the leadership level and hopefully get a session, another session to be scheduled to address these grave concerns, because that shouldn't be happening at all, and I feel really bad for you. So thank you again for your comments and for your support on this major initiative, and hopefully soon we'll all be in a position where we will be exercising our inherent right and jurisdiction on child welfare in a manner that is reflective of who we are as people so that we can take care of our children the right way. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciating Catherine's got a plane to catch. You're welcome to stay as long as you can and leave when you need to, Catherine. Mike. Regional Chief? Defer to the next one. Okay, appreciating that. Thank you to the panel. Acknowledging Councillor Abbott had her hand up early, but we're already an hour into the 1 hour long agenda item. We still have one presentation to go, so I didn't allow any further questions or comments. Inviting forward Cookby Christian. Either one. Either one, yep. Yep. mic 23.
Can everybody hear me back there? No? All right, video. Okay. White Cohatap, Kalmakswas, Wanapchina, Jal Kukwi Spelachina, Chief Wing Christian. The time is short, and I know that the Kukukbis, you've had a lot of information sort of run through you this last day and a half. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of cut this presentation short, but this is about laws, jurisdiction, and how you move things forward, and what we've been doing for almost 40 years in our community around our children. And I wanted to say to the Union of BC Indian Chiefs that you supported what we did in 1980 under the leadership of Grand Chief George Manuel. He was president at the time. He worked with us to stand up our laws for our children. Albeit under the Indian Act, it was still a process we were looking at in terms of Section 9124 and how we expanded our jurisdiction, our laws. We've always been there. So I'm going to talk a bit about that in terms of, I appreciate what some of the chiefs have said about what you're doing in the area of jurisdiction. It's really important. So this gives you I'll run through some of this stuff. The Secwepemc Nation, there's 32 communities, 17 Indian Act bands. And again, it's around the 32 communities we're trying to regenerate who we are as a nation. In 1980, we had a situation where a young mother came to myself. I was chief at the time in my council and asked for help because her boys were going to be apprehended. And what we then did is we just asked the question of our elders, because that's what we're taught to do, is you turn to your elders and for the wisdom and advice. We asked them the question, how did we look after ourselves before the white people imposed their law on us? And so what they said is that we had an actual system in place, an Indian court, where we actually had a process that we looked after ourselves and governed ourselves. We also had jails, we had policemen, we had a whole judicial system in place. And so what they said to us is that this is what we do. In 1979, for a whole year, we sat down with the community, with the young lawyer at that time, Louise Mandel, and drafted out our legislation, section by section. And it's really important because it comes from our community, comes from our elders. And what's stunning to me is when we're talking about federal legislation, some of the principles across the country, everything that's been talked about across the country is embedded in our legislation already. It was kind of stunning when we were listening to that session down in Richmond. The wisdom of our people and our elders. Listen to your elders. They know what they're talking about. Really, really important. So this process, I think, is critical because in our legislation, we have a section that calls notwithstanding residency. I heard some discussion around that. So wherever our children are, we've been able to go and work with them. We've been in Texas, Georgia, we've been all across the provinces. We've been most of the cities in British Columbia, but it's really, our law doesn't end when they leave the supposed reserve. It goes wherever they are, and it's really important. And again, it's a modern day expression of who we are in our actual traditional law. As most of you know, is the Indian Child Caravan is how we sort of launched this because the province wouldn't recognize our jurisdiction, and the federal government was silent on child welfare because they gave that all to the province. So in the Indian Child Caravan, when we got this, Grace McCarthy, the Deputy Premier at the time, she agreed to recognize our jurisdiction, to return our children, that we would jointly plan for each child that was in their care back to us, and we would seek resources from the federal government. That's what we agreed to on October 16th of 1980. October 6th, it says there. And so that really, how we sort of launched this in 1980. Jump forward 30 years into the future, nation stuff and what's going on. We work together as the Kukukbi, the chiefs, with this declaration to work together for our children in 2009, all 17 Indian Act communities. And what we really looked at is how do we have a unity declaration, how do we work together for our children? And what this really does is we have to look at how do we develop our own national sort of act, and how do we actually help our community heal from past traumas. That's part of the issue of child welfare, is the trauma that's taken place in our children through the residential schools and all those things, and 60 Scoop, et cetera. We really need to improve the current services. The current services are a delegated model where you're applying provincial law on your children. It doesn't work. We say we have to change that system. It's really important. And again, the issue of the capacity, this was the pre-CRTC, the Community Human Rights ruling. And we have to make sure that all services include Secwepemcin or our language as terms as a part of the whole process. And really about collaboration and how do we develop community-based models, not just nation models, but community-based models that work in the community. It's really important. No, I'm going the wrong way. I went backwards. I got it. Yeah, okay, Bob, I know you got something smart ass to say. Anyways, that's Chamberlain. So this is what's important is we've been doing research. We've been working with the University of Victoria. You've heard their Indigenous Law program. We've been working with them to look at how do we utilize that process to start developing our own law, you know, Komipala as it's called. And our laws come from our oral history. And it's really kind of astounding if you start looking at your oral history, how many of your laws deal with child neglect? And what is the consequences of that child neglect? When that child is neglected, what happens to them? In most of the stories we have, the ultimate price is always paid by the child, usually death. And it's really important to understand the issue of child neglect in our oral history because that's how we actually have an alliance with the Okanagan is through a story about how children were neglected and went there and how we actually had to mend that relationship. It's really kind of interesting if you start looking at your oral history. Embedded in your laws is through your language and your oral history. So it's really important you look at that. So it really is about developing holistic community-based prevention integrated models because that's really what we're looking at. How do we actually develop our own national jurisdiction act for our children? And as most communities, we've got a variety of jurisdictions in the territory, delegated authorities, our jurisdiction, so it's really important we all work together. We see the delegated process as an interim measure. That's what it was always said to be. And it's going to transition us towards jurisdiction. That's how we hope to move this forward in the future. One of the most important things that has happened in the nation-to-nation stuff with Canada is that when they made the announcement, Trudeau made that announcement in Gatineau, right after that we went to the Minister Bennett and I said to her, I says, look, we understand what nation-to-nation means, but we need to take this to our people to ask them, what do they see as a nation-to-nation relationship in Canada today in 2018 or 2016? And really, the Shuswap Nation Tribal Council is not a nation. We're just an administrative body to help this work along and to create that dialogue. And what people identified as 5 priorities in the nation, we did about 18 months, almost 2 years, different communities. We went around and talked about what is a nation-to-nation relationship. Of course, recognition of title and rights. They talk about governance of the territory, but governance by standing up our families, not traditional governance as we think about it. It's about the actual families and how we do that. Language is really critical in the nation-to-nation relationship. And our laws, and language and laws go together. And it ties into lands and resources because that sort of all ties together, and that's what people see as a priority. And healing. Healing needs to be, looking after our children. We need to heal from that past trauma, and what a better way than to take care of our children is how we do that through our families. So what we've evolved into in the nation is trying to go back to our traditional seasonal rounds and gather as a nation on a seasonal basis. We started in Revelstoke, we've gone, and it started from 200, and we get 400, and we go into spring, summer, fall, and we're actually going to go into Vancouver and do a seasonal gathering there for our people that live in the city. But the seasonal gatherings really sort of evolve a process of how do we actually sort of get back on the land. The last one that was held in the Sketum or Esket is that we had 600 people in attendance. And what was happening is that we were teaching all kinds of things were going on, whether it was how to cut fish and how to can fish and some stuff around making weapons and stuff like that. And so it really is a process of gathering ourselves on our territory again. And a big part of it is really how do we actually, in that seasonal rounds, reestablish our roles, if you will, on the territory, our governance. And one of the most important things that happened at Skedem is that with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs is we have a peace and cooperation treaty with them because as a result of the Delgamuukw with the Sewe case in 1997. Our chiefs supported them, raised money, and provided that to those hereditary chiefs. And they, in turn, entered into a treaty with us by handing us a plaque that talked about we have a peace and cooperation. And that's so we picked that up and said, hey, we're going to work together for our children. What they're doing for their children, we'll support, and what we're doing for our children. It's, again, nation to nation. Not necessarily with Canada, nation to nation as we understand it with other nations as we see it. So this is not without a lot of bumps on the road because we have almost 40 years of experience in fighting the provincial government on child welfare, right from the ground up, you know, and we actually had to file a civil claim challenging their jurisdiction in 2016 because they kept taking us to court saying they had jurisdiction for our children. And we said, no, you don't. We have exclusive jurisdiction for our children, notwithstanding residency, wherever they go. We actually had 7 or 8 court cases we had before the courts. So what we did is we filed this to say that we have jurisdiction. And out of that process, we began talking about maybe we can actually enter into some way of working together. And that's where the MOU came. And we were asserting jurisdiction, exclusive jurisdiction for our children and saying the province has no role whatsoever to play in the process. So we actually had a signing in July of this year. We're going to finish it off October 17th with Minister Philippot. She's coming here to the Secwepemc territory and we're going to sign with those chiefs that haven't signed on yet. And it really is about how do we actually work together collectively to stand up our jurisdiction again. What does the actual MOU represent? It really does represent a commitment to recognize and implement our jurisdiction as Secwepemc people. And that's where we're going to get to. And I think we're really looking at a jurisdiction agreement, an operational agreement, and a transition plan because we have to transition out of the delegated model into a jurisdiction model, and that's going to take some time. And really, it's not a legally binding agreement. It's really about relationships and building that. So I think it's really important, you know, that what we're doing is establishing a working group amongst our people. We're working to confirm the budget and moving that stuff forward. So it's really about jurisdiction. And I just want to end by saying that was a real short version of this. If you want us to come and talk more about it, we can. But I'm mindful that I keep hearing our elder Hazel talk about take action. And I think this is what it's about for children. Listen to your elders. We did in 1979-80, and it took us to a whole different level, a different place. But also be mindful that your children are watching. Everything that you do is they watch not what you say, but what you do. And it's really, really important. So you have to stand up your laws. Everybody here, all of you here have laws. Hereditary systems, laws for your children, grandmothers and grandparents, the role they played. That was our institution of protection for our children was our grandparents. Let's start standing that back up. And it's not the same everywhere. You have different ways to do it, but it's the same kind of principle. Whatever we do, we have to have community-driven, nation-based processes. So your community drives it within your nation. It rests with your families. So again, I thank the Union of BC Indian Chiefs for supporting us in 1980 with the Indian Child Caravan and everything we've been doing since then. Because we are now a population of about 1,000. We were 350 at that time. So we know where every child is that's been born into our community since 1980. We know where every child is, and we know what children are needed in terms of what they need. And we have currently about 5 to 6% of our children in care under our law. And I think that's what's important with this process. We know how this works. And so honor your elders, listen to them, and stand up your own law. You have it. And that's what it is you have your law. Stand it up. And we'll support you like you supported us back in 1980 in whichever way, because this federal legislation is important because we need the feds and the province to get out of the way so you can stand up the laws for your children. and stop the apprehensions. Stop those children being removed. Because when you do that, you'll see a whole turnaround in your community in terms of where it goes, and it's about taking action. So again, I thank you for the opportunity to present this afternoon, and like I said, anytime, you can find me online. I'm not going to give my cell number out. Cook's Gem. Thank you very much.
Cook's Gem, Cookby, Cookby is given an open invitation for anybody to engage him directly. We won't go to questions and comments. So thank you, Cookby. Inviting forward Regional Chief Terry Teegee and Jessica Clogg for an environmental assessment legislation update, followed by Cookby Ignis. Will have a video after this session here. He's got about a 6-minute video that we're going to go through. Environmental assessment legislation. Who would like to go first? RC, Mike 22.
Masai, thank you. Once again, want to acknowledge the territory, the Kamloops people and Shuswap people. Thank you. Masicho. So on the environmental assessment file, I was appointed as the political lead in regards to the environmental assessment legislation. Over the last few months, we've been in deep discussions with the Minister of Environment, George Heyman, and his staff in regards to developing the legislation. And right now, the process, we've had several meetings over the last few months, and looking at the intentions paper, which will advise the drafting of the legislation. I think where we're at right now is that we had a lot of good commitment from the minister himself, Minister Heyman. Good words in terms of implementing the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, free, prior, and informed consent. But we're really right now at an impasse. Minister Heyman is struggling with the fact that there isn't legislation that fully adopted the declaration and the tenet of free, prior, and informed consent. From our perspective, from the First Nations perspective and all the communities, what we heard was that we want the ability to make decisions on major projects and whenever there's an environmental assessment implemented on any projects. So really what we're coming to is we need some political help in terms of pushing this NDP government to fully implement the declaration. Next week there is a meeting in Musqueam on October 10th and 11th. Minister will be there, and I certainly hope that many of you chiefs that are involved in terms of your interests in regards to environmental assessment are there to reiterate what we said last time we met back in June of this year, where we stated that anything less of free, prior, and informed consent will be a failure. Barring the fact that we're still looking at federally a rights recognition implementation framework, and we're also implementing the first commitment in the commitments document to look at implementing the rights and recognition of our people in regards to the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People. This was one of those commitments. If you recall, there was 3 priorities. One was child welfare, we just heard about. The next was environmental assessment, and the third one we still need to really work on is forestry. Those 3 priorities. So much of my work that I have done this before becoming a chief is in the forestry realm of the world. But my colleague here, Jessica, has been working diligently and hard on this, and in the rooms with the Environmental Assessment Office, as well as with the First Nations Energy and Mining Council, and much of the staff that have been in the trenches really working with the EAO, trying to work with the EAO, but there continues to be a pushback from bureaucrats that don't want this going forward, in light that there hasn't been provincial legislation to adopt UNDRIP and FPIC. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't stop. We shouldn't stop for full recognition to have consent. Right now, what they're talking at is seeking consent. We want to get to full consent in regards to making decisions within our jurisdiction as Indigenous peoples and our governance. So I'll leave that and pass it on to my colleague, Jessica.
Mic 23.
Good afternoon. My name's Jessica Clogg. I'm an Indigenous rights and environmental lawyer, and as the regional chief said, I've been supporting the Leadership Council and the First Nations Energy and Mining Council, who is mandated by resolution of UBCIC to support leadership on the environmental assessment file. I want to recognize the Kamloops and the Secwepemc people for allowing us to be here and do our work here today. And I'm very honored to be here on the 50th anniversary, and also very much want to hold my hands up to the UBCIC for the years of tireless advocacy on behalf of all of the many matters that they're mandated to work on for the members. So the purpose of my remarks this afternoon is really to provide a snapshot of what we understand BC's intentions to be on environmental assessment and how they measure up to the changes that have been demanded by First Nations. And this is a snapshot because, as the regional chief said, we are at this critical moment. We've had some very important commitments made around implementation of the UN Declaration, the TRC calls to action, and the Chilcotin decision. And we are at a moment where BC is about to release an intentions paper about what they're going to do, with legislation very quickly to follow. Therefore, we have a window really over the next few weeks to move BC from where they are currently at closer to where we need them to be. So there are two documents that have come around as handouts. The first is a submission made in July from the First Nations Leadership Council to Minister Heyman. The second is a table which very briefly summarizes our understanding of BC's current intentions and how they measure up. Before I get into that detail, one of the things I want to emphasize is that environmental assessment is not just a matter for technicians. It is true that there are many complex matters related to caring for the land and water that emerge in assessment. But really, at a more fundamental level, this is about self-determination. This is about the question of whether or not proposed activities should be allowed to proceed in a nation's territory, whether they are consistent with that nation's own laws and responsibilities to their people, to their ancestors, to the land and the water. And therefore, the degree to which we are able to achieve recognition of that self-determination and that decision-making in this context is very much not just a technical matter, but very much a question of jurisdiction that concerns all of us. So first, the commitment to upholding the UN Declaration in the context of environmental assessment. Now, what I will say is interesting about this dialogue is that we've moved from a place of denial, right? We no longer have provincial bureaucrats saying, we don't want to have anything to do with the UN Declaration. We've moved into a space where they're saying the limited improvements that we're talking about are consistent with the Declaration. And so that is sort of the new dynamic that we're having to deal with. But at this stage, BC is not making a commitment that their minister must uphold the UN Declaration in making decisions. Now, that doesn't mean there might not be some reference to it in the Act. But is the minister actually required to uphold the declaration or be consistent with it? Not yet. At this stage, The province is not contemplating that any form of government-to-government agreement will be required before an EA process begins. In other words, about what the process will be. And they anticipate that the minister will continue to be able to exempt projects entirely from environmental assessment, even if they're on the project regulation, or to grant an environmental assessment certificate without Indigenous consent. Now, what BC's intentions is to implement what I would call sort of an ill-defined approach to technical collaboration or consensus seeking with Indigenous nations at several points. In other words, they perceive that they're willing to engage in enhanced dialogue, to seek consensus, not consent, but consensus at a technical level. But at the end of the day, what they're contemplating is that the decision by an Indigenous governing body to grant or withhold consent would merely be a consideration for provincial decision makers. Another key element of the Leadership Council submission, and of course many of your submissions, was the need to advance self-determination through fully funded Indigenous-led assessments based on Indigenous law, knowledge, and best available science, as well as Indigenous-led monitoring. Now, one of the steps that BC has committed to is that if a nation wants to do the assessment on the potential impacts of a project on them, on their nation, on their rights, they are not going to deny that. If a nation says that's what they want to do, BC is saying, yes, we'll put that in the process order, that'll be part of the assessment. But the question of whether an Indigenous assessment would be the assessment, in other words, the main evaluation of the project to make a recommendation to Indigenous and provincial decision makers, still would require additional action from BC. So it's that piece where that recognition is only coming by basically approval or agreement from BC. Now, on the positive side, what we're anticipating is that BC's legislation will be open to varying virtually any aspect of environmental assessment through government-to-government agreement. In other words, if a standing agreement is negotiated about how you want environmental assessment done in your territory, we anticipate that BC will then make the changes necessary or essentially enable that to be the process, right up to the point of completely substituting an Indigenous assessment in lieu of a provincial assessment. So that is a positive thing. If you can get the government-to-government agreement, then we're anticipating that there would be quite a bit of space here. There is also potential that there may be a trigger that requires the province to negotiate. But where they've stopped short is saying that they're actually, if you want to have a government-to-government agreement, you want your assessment to be the assessment, that they are not willing to go to the stage of saying, yes, that has to be in place, that agreement has to be in place before a project could go ahead. We're not anticipating at this stage that they have any intention of explicitly recognizing Indigenous-led monitoring, compliance, or enforcement. In other words, they're not anticipating any explicit recognition for Indigenous guardian programs. What we anticipate that they will be bringing forward is the potential for provincial powers to be delegated and for agreements to be worked out around compliance and monitoring. So a way of looking at that is they're stopping short of full rights and jurisdiction recognition, and they're essentially saying you need this in-between stage of reaching agreement. You need our agreement before we're going to recognize Indigenous-led monitoring and guardianship, although there is that potential if that authority is sort of drawn down. At the moment, there is no commitment to full funding of Indigenous-led assessments. There is likely to be new funding mechanisms for Indigenous participation in assessment, but what's open right now is, will that actually apply to the governance aspects of assessment? If you're doing your own assessment, is the company going to have to foot the bill? Or will the funding only be for participation in BC's assessment? One thing to emphasize is that BC has not been open to talking about any form of institutional change. So you may recall, of course, this issue has been the subject of resolutions of UBCIC for many years, going back to 2009, where the very center of the proposal was the need for a new arm's-length co-governed body to manage assessment. At this stage, there has been no openness to institutional change. We're likely to see some new mechanisms around independent experts' involvement or peer review of evidence. As I mentioned, the potential through agreement to have substitution of Indigenous assessment. But really, the highly discretionary and powerful role of the Environmental Assessment Office has not really ever come onto the table. And that's in part because the province has put the Environmental Assessment Office at the forefront of the negotiations. And so, of course, it's unlikely that they're going to negotiate away any of their power. We are anticipating that the existing agreement between the Environmental Assessment Office and Canada will be overtaken by a new agreement that would contemplate substitution to Indigenous nations and Indigenous-led assessment. We're not quite at the point where they're agreeing that that would be a tripartite agreement. A third area that was a central part of the Leadership Council submission, and many hundreds of submissions during the comment period on the discussion paper, was the need for a clear legislated test for approval or rejection of projects. In other words, right now there is no bottom line. We sometimes talk about the environmental assessment process as a pathway to yes. And part of the reason for that is that there is no test. There's no bottom line, nothing that says if it's this bad, we're not going to approve it. And this has been an area, unfortunately, where, as we understand BC's intentions, there has been little progress. They are unwilling to include any legislative test or mandatory decision criteria for environmental assessment approvals beyond a broad public interest test. They fail to understand the challenges for Indigenous peoples with a public interest test that involves an open-ended balancing of any factor that the minister wishes to take into consideration. For example, in the submission, we talked about decision criteria including the need to have consent from all impacted nations, to respect ecological limits, or to respect BC's climate targets, our international climate commitments, the idea of a climate test. That is not something we're anticipating as part of BC's intentions right now, and that remains a major issue. They have been willing to talk about mandatory things to assess, so mandatory things that must be taken into account or considered, but nothing that presents an actual test beyond this broad public interest idea. A fourth key area emphasized in the Leadership Council submission is that we must begin dealing with cumulative effects beyond the project level. Environmental assessment is not just about project assessment. It is about the needs of the people and the species and the land, and what are the limits that need to be placed on human activities to care for those things. And for far-reaching species, for salmon, for bears, for our water, that doesn't stop at the boundaries of any project area. We need tools like regional assessment that looks at the needs of species and of rights and of values at a broader scale and then aligns our human activities with those. We need to look at broader policies and plans to ensure so that everything isn't focused in on these particular projects. Right now, many projects and activities do not receive an assessment at all, and that was another point emphasized in many submissions, including the Leadership Council submission. We must ensure that all projects with the potential to impact on title and rights are assessed. In terms of where we understand BC's intentions to be right now, they are not proposing that there would be any mandatory regional assessments or legal requirements to implement them if they do occur. There is the potential for a future regulation, and they are indicating that there will be a future consultation on a regulation that would flesh out the details, but nothing would be mandatory in the Act. It would be a discretionary power to do a regional assessment, but it wouldn't be required. In terms of broadening what gets assessed, whether you're worried about placer mining or forestry activities or a variety of other things that aren't currently assessed, that is all being pushed to a future conversation about revising the reviewable projects regulation. So there will be a series, we understand, of future dialogue or future consultation on those regulations, but nothing new in the Act that would ensure that more projects get assessed. We do anticipate that Indigenous peoples will be able to request an assessment, but exactly how that will play out isn't clear. And at this stage, BC has not been open to the idea that if a First Nation says an assessment is required, that one would occur. Finally, many of you will remember that there have been some proposals about dispute resolution in the Act, and what we're anticipating is a proposal for time-bound, optional, and non-binding processes that would provide process support when disputes arise during an environmental assessment. So as BC is envisioning it, dispute resolution is really their backup plan if consensus isn't reached at a technical level at various points in the process. And with the appropriate safeguards, the idea of an optional, non-binding dispute resolution process might have potential, but at this stage we're being asked to accept a new EA regime, new environmental assessment regime, based on a largely unknown dispute resolution mechanism. Dispute resolution would be another area that BC plans to hold a future consultation on. So we're anticipating regulatory consultations on fees, on the fees companies would have to pay, on regional assessment, on what gets assessed, as well as dispute resolution. But the Act itself will contain little detail on any of those matters. I think that the takeaway from all of this is that the commitments that have been made are not yet embodied in the actual intentions that BC is expressing, but we do now have a window to very forcefully encourage them to step up to the plate, to live up to those commitments. So we're not in a place where we're saying we don't care about the UN Declaration, and we need to get them to a place where they understand that an environmental assessment act needs to be a consent-based regime that upholds Indigenous self-determination and jurisdiction, and actually includes some bottom lines that protect the land, air, and water.
Thank you. Opening up to questions and comments. Like 8.
Fred Robbins, Chief of Alkali Lake. A bit of concern. You've been talking a lot about assessments. And even after all those assessments are complete and the project gets to go ahead, one of the concerns that I hear and I notice is with all your assessments that you've done, there's nothing on compliance and enforcement for the First Nations people. If the First Nations say, okay, you can put your mine here, but these are some of the things that you have to follow. And by the way, here's the funding agreement that you can sign. You sign off on the funding agreement. By the end of the day, there's nothing there for compliance and enforcement on behalf of the First Nations people because the First Nations already signed the agreement. and agreed to the assessment process and all of the assessments that have been done. Assessment, 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 but there's nothing for compliance and enforcement on behalf of the First Nations people. I haven't heard you mention anything along those lines, because if it is a pipeline that's going in, it's going to be there for 40, 50, 60 years. And then once that well runs dry, what's going to happen with all the piping in the ground? You know, there needs to be an enforcement process to follow through so that the environment is taken care of, even after they've removed all the ore, removed all the oil. We as First Nations people, and I'm sure we can all agree, that we want it to be back to as close to as it was before they even started the mining process or any forestation, reforestation. All of these practices need to be done, but there's nothing on compliance and enforcement. So I'm just kind of curious, has any other First Nations brought this forward? And when it comes to major proponents that are going to make billions of dollars within our territories and in our backyards, does it follow the First Nations to clean that up? Or how is that going to work? Is like with the compliance and enforcement end on that? I'm putting that to the floor. Thank you.
Chairman Cookby, we'll hear from the chiefs and then have you respond all at once. Mike 17.
Byron Lewis, Okanagan man, Chief Okanagan man. I was just going through some of this and looking at that, and it looks like one of the things that's going to be the outcome is another MOU with BCEAO, and I guess now it's environmentalist or the new Environmental Assessment Act. But if we actually look at most of the problems that are in British Columbia, is actually a direct cause of the EAO process. Now, if that MOU is to take a lead, I think that's something that should be a cause of real concern. And the other point I think needs to be made is if you actually look at some of the discussions we had earlier on about the listing of species in the province of British Columbia is directly attributable to the province's use of Section 92 authority, and yet we're told by court decisions like Delgamuukh and all these other ones that say a province may only infringe on Aboriginal rights. They do not have the constitutional authority to extinguish. But if you look at that in that context, they are the major cause of decline of species to the point of requiring listing. And basically that is a serious infringement of not only our Aboriginal rights, but also their constitutional authority. And the other thing that really causes me concern is how do they actually measure an impact to an Aboriginal right? What's the socioeconomic analysis model that they're basically using to actually determine that right beyond, so chief, where do you pick berries, or so chief, where do you go fishing? That is not a measure of economic impact. And when they're doing these, and mostly they come to us and ask us a few simple questions, but I think some of the things that we really need to hold them to task on is recent court decisions, the one that came out of Clyde River, and again, the most recent one on Trans Mountain. You know, Clyde River talked about the need to actually identify what are the actual impacts to the Aboriginal right in question. Okay, what are the actual impacts? And they need the process to actually show us how they're measuring. How are they actually making that determination? Because we all know if you go through any of their processes, they have socioeconomic impact analysis. The most recent one comes to memory is the one about the increase or decrease of TSU in the province. You know, the annual allowable cut. You know, they went through the village dog up to the regional doctors to come back and say, oh, these are going to economically impact these sectors, but where is actually the impact to Aboriginal people? Because we do not access our food, we do not access fish, we do not access the species we're dependent on. Most recent one we read about is the impact of moose. and that is being managed by the province under Section 92. So this really causes me concern, because there's also the issue, and this is one of the things we really need to come to grips with, is that the province is in a conflict of interest whenever they make a determination of Aboriginal right or title, because they are the direct beneficiary of any decision they make. So that is something that really needs to be addressed under these entire processes, and it's not. Because the only thing that stops them from actually extinguishing our rights is basically that Species at Risk Act, and that should not be the only legislative tool that we have available to prevent that. Look at Mount Pooley with what happened with that. That's a prime example of provincial management in action. You know, the sediments coming out of there are going to impact that spawning bed for probably, you know, for generations, not measuring annual, but what about the access to salmon for the people in that area? And you could go on. Columbia River, Tecominco dumping in tailings into the Columbia River to the point where they're taken to court by a tribe in the south that actually identified impacts that's literally in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and that Tecominco is on the hook for cleanup. So I think these are some of the things we really need to actually start addressing whenever we're talking about the EAO and that process. And they cannot be the judge, jury, and executioner when it comes to decisions on environment, because they are in a direct conflict of interest, and it's about time we hold them to task on that. Okay, thank you.
Lim Chief, mic 18.
Why is squeezing Kilo Chin? I'm the chief of the Penticton Indian Band in the South Okanagan. And what we've done at home, because we live in one of the probably most sensitive areas in the province, Canada has identified the South Okanagan as one of the hot spots in Canada for species at risk. And the reason they say it's a hot spot is because the Tamih are disappearing from existence. They're becoming extinct. So I'm going to just stress the urgency that we need to do something about it, like we heard yesterday. We've engaged with a number of language speakers and knowledge keepers in our community, and they expressed the way that we need to do this in our customary way. We need to help each other help the land. We can't even drink the water. What are we going to give to our kids? You want to talk about environmental impacts? We used to be able to drink the water. So we're talking about a lot more than just a policy. You know, we're talking about our own existence here on this earth. And I think that's the significance that we need to put in terms of the conversations that we're having. We have to. Why are we waiting for the province to put something in place? You know, I'm going to ask that question. There's enough of us that absolutely believe that our existence is probably the most critical thing that we need to talk about. And we can only do that by helping each other take care of the land. So I just want to ask, why are we waiting for the province?
Lim Chief, mic 20.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Cheryl Casimir, First Nations Summit. Thank you, Regional Chief and Jessica, for the report. I just want to reiterate the importance of leadership representation at the forum next week. I think that we can't let the province off the hook in terms of consent-based legislation. At the forum that was held in Musqueam previous, he made that verbal commitment. And I think that we're in the era of reconciliation and new relationships between ourselves and the Crown, that we're beyond where you can say one thing one day and act differently the next. It's totally unacceptable. So I really urge people to make sure that you attend and that those voices are heard. We need to apply the pressure necessary to make the province accept what we want. I also wanted to just raise a point that I shared with delegates at the Wild Salmon Summit. Just last week, or of recent, the United Nations came out with a report by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Victoria, I'm going to kill her name, but Corpuz, I can't say it. Anyways, she did a report on the effects of huge development on indigenous lands, most particularly in Brazil and Guatemala. But I think that her recommendations in her report support what's happening here as well in British Columbia and in Canada. And one of the things that she said was that human rights impact assessments need to be done. They need to support environmental assessments because the impact should also examine the possible impacts of proposed projects and policies on the enjoyment of all relevant rights, including the rights to life, health, food, water, housing, and culture. And so I think, you know, when the UN is putting forth these reports and recommendations, Canada is a party to, and which in turn means British Columbia is. And so they need to uphold these reports and these recommendations that come about. And so I think we need to put pressure on them. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. We're way behind time. We'll have one final speaker, Mike 4.
Hello, thank you. Cookby Ronigny, Skitchis, and Swapapulu. I just wanted to say, as you all know, you guys all have heard about the KGHM Ajax mine. They were bound and determined, along with Christy Clark, and with the support of Kathy McLeod over there for the Progressive Conservatives in this area, that they were going to get that mine done. But I lift my hands up to the heads of the families from 13 heads of families from Skitchison and 13 heads of families from Kamloops here, who stood together, and based on our laws, we did an assessment on it. We didn't wait around. We asked the government to do an environmental assessment, an independent assessment. They refused, so we said, we're going to do this ourselves, and we did it. And without getting into you all have heard the story, but there's a model there where we don't depend on the government's laws. We depend and stand on our laws and make determination, self-determination acts, and say no if that's what the people decided, and that's what they decided. And we got the federal and provincial governments to agree with us and not allow that, not give a permit to that mine. So there's a model there that can be used across this province, and I'm going to do a presentation where we can, again, in another field within our lands, utilize our laws to control the land and its resources. Thank you.
Cookshem Cookby, as briefly as you can, responses, Mike 23.
I think what I would say fundamentally is that the dialogue and the way that the technicians and the lawyers under the guidance of the Leadership Council have been approaching this conversation about environmental assessment is to say Indigenous nations have the jurisdiction, you have the laws, you have the responsibility, and you will be exercising those to make decisions. And the question for this legislative reform in all of the areas you mentioned, from compliance and enforcement to relationships with Canada, to looking holistically at the economies and cultures of Indigenous peoples, is not whether that law and that jurisdiction exists, not whether it will be exercised, but what is BC going to do about that? Are they going to recognize those decisions that are made by nations, and are they going to structure their legislation to ensure that self-determination is upheld? And all of the points that were raised here are incredibly important. If you have the opportunity to come and deliver that message in Musqueam next week, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Regional Chief, Mike 22.
Yes, thank you. We'll hopefully see you next week and hear these stories of what your communities had to do in regards to environmental assessments. And I know for my communities that I used to represent at Carrie-Sakani Tribal Council, we had to do our own. And we participated in the LNG environmental assessments, but they all ended up in court. And the reason why is that the current EA system is very limited. More often than not, whether it's federal or provincial, their scope is very limited. They don't want to look at the effects on the greenhouse gases. They don't want to look at the effects that'll have on orcas or whales or the shipping routes. And that was really limited in terms of what we wanted to see as Indigenous peoples in regards to how these projects are going to affect our people. And it's much more than just a linear project, much more than just a pipeline or this area within where a mine is or what have you. So it's really important that, very similar to what you heard earlier on here with child and welfare, sometimes you have to take it in your own hands and begin your own EA process like Ron was talking about. And that's what we did too in many respects with the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline, where we did our Aboriginal interest and use study and we couldn't support the project. So sometimes if this doesn't work, you're going to have to take it back into your own hands and initiate your own governance. So in the meantime, we'll do as much as we can and really advocate in your behalf to get a legislation that's meaningful, a legislation that would adopt the United Nations Declaration and a legislation that has your consent. So thank you. Merci.
Masai Cho, Regional Chief. Thank you, Jessica. We're going to make a few minutes available, up to 7 minutes maybe, for a video that Cookby Ignace is going to introduce, or Cookby Day, or both of them, but we really don't have much time, so a brief introduction would be greatly appreciated at mic 3.